Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel at Columbia Law School. I will just give a few seconds and then we will officially begin. Thank you. Hello again. Thank you for joining us for the second in a series of conversations on racial justice organized by the Office of Social Justice Initiatives, the Human Rights Institute, and BALSA. My name is Cassandra Thiano, and I am the Assistant Director for Human Rights and Public International Law at the Office of Social Justice Initiatives. We are joined today by an amazing lineup of speakers. Commissioner Margaret May McCulley from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, Jamil Dakor from the ACLU, Salma El Hosseini from the International Service for Human Rights, and Dr. Vicky Casanova Willis of the US Human Rights Network. Their full bios will be included in the chat. Before we begin, I am going to paraphrase a statement from my office, which situates this conversation. One of the core values of Columbia Law School is the belief that serving the public interest should be a part of the professional life of every one of our students and graduates. At Social Justice Initiatives, our mission is to make this belief a reality by inspiring and preparing students and graduates to pursue public service and public interest work throughout their careers. We aim to prepare the next generation of change agents to lead efforts to make the world a better place. More than a career office, we also see ourselves as an advocacy center, both as a hub for activity and thought leadership around social justice and social change at the law school, and as a force for advocating for justice on behalf of our students, graduates, and the larger world. We have a responsibility to educate ourselves and each other of the law of each other on the role of law in the creation and continuation of injustice, both domestically and globally. Now is the time to think deeply about our own roles in the legal system and how we can use our legal training to respond to these injustices to right these wrongs. We encourage you to fight for a system in which you believe, for a world in which you want to live, one in which the statement Black Lives Matter isn't just a slogan, but a way of life. So this is how we are going to proceed. I am going to ask a set of prepared questions to our panelists, and I encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A box. We will try to get to as many of them at the end of our chat. I also want to acknowledge that today is International Women's Day, so happy International Women's Day. It is also the first day of the jury selection for the trial of Derek Chauvin, who is one of the officers who participated in the death of George Floyd. And that subsequently set in motion or reset in motion a global movement to recognize the dignity of Black lives. So without further ado, I will quickly talk about, I will quickly say that the last time our conversation was more global. We kind of did a world tour talking about how different local movements are addressing the issue of racial justice. But today we're going to take a deeper look into what's happening vis-a-vis the United States. So Margaret, I will start with Margaret, with Commissioner McCulley. You sit on the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, which is the regional human rights body that promotes and protects human rights in the Americas, and you hear cases against the United States and other countries. You have also been specifically focused on the rights of women as the rapporteur for the rights of women, and also the rapporteur for the rights of people of African descent. Can you tell us what you see as the most important role of the Commission today, as well as its biggest strength, the biggest strength of the human rights framework? So please, Margaret, feel free to unmute yourself and share with us.
Hi, thank you, Cassandra, and thank you to the Social Justice Initiative for the invitation. And as the Rapporteur on Women's Rights, could I wish everyone, all the panelists, including Jamil, and, and all those who are attending this event, the best of International Women's Day. We need some uplift because there have been so many regressions of women's rights in the last few years. And we hope they will not continue and that states will keep to their commitments. Okay, the Commission and the most important role. The Commission is the principal organ of the Inter-American states, and it is responsible for the whole region, all the states in the region, to promote and advance the protection of human rights in the region. And that role is extremely large because it also monitors the activities within states to see whether they are meeting their commitments. Because as I'm sure we all know, states and through their governments and ministerial spokespersons make all sorts of promises, say all sorts of things, guarantee all sorts of things, but then they tend to forget them after the camera has moved to someone else. So therefore, the Commission monitors the activities of states in order to try to keep them within their roles as in fact the primary movers for the protection of the human rights of their citizens. And we also try to assist states in that regard. We give states technical assistance, and we also try to imbibe into people themselves what their rights are, what they can expect in the enjoyment of their rights, so that they can recognize when any of their rights have been violated. And we work with state parties, their officials, the victims themselves, the victims' representatives, and civil society in trying to come to meet our mandate as we should. And we also assist in this regard and try to push the agenda forward by publishing special reports on specific issues of human rights to make the whole region understand these issues much better. And we also, we also use and treat intersectionally with other rapporteurships within the Commission in order to ensure that, for instance, the women's rapporteurships, my rapporteurship and that or my one on Afro-descendant rights and against racism, racial discrimination. While working together with the other rapporteurships, we try to have a more substantial advance in the protection of human rights. And the most important and challenging thing is that we have to deal with states in that regard. I don't know how much time I have left.
You have 2 or 3 more minutes, so please go ahead.
The rapporteurship on, for instance, on the rights of Afro-descendants came about because the Commission recognizes, because once the Commission recognizes a need for special focus through rapporteurships, we would establish a rapporteurship. Because 2 years ago, 3 years, almost 3 years now, we set into place a special rapporteurship on economic, social, and environmental rights, because we realized that we had not been focusing enough on these things, which is very important for women's rights. And so I work very closely with that special rapporteur. Special rapporteurs are employees of the commission and work as officers of the Secretariat, which the rapporteurships of commissioners is quite different. We are not employees. And we try to focus not only our attention, but the attention of the OAS in Permanent Council and during the General Assembly on also, and in our annual reports on the failings of the states in honoring their rights, and with the hope of pressuring them to implement our recommendations and to uphold the rights of all. I'll leave it there and wait for the next question.
Thank you, Margaret. So this is great because it dovetails well with Jamil, who has interacted a lot with the Inter-American Commission on the issue of racial justice. So Jamil, you are at the ACLU and you've been working to use the human rights framework to address a range of issues from police violence to immigration to gender justice in the United States. But for some reason, human rights remains in the blind spot for a lot of national NGOs, right? This is in part because of this predominant idea of US exceptionalism, that somehow the US is above global accountability. So what are some of the ways that you and your allies are challenging this narrative? And what have been some of the tangible outcomes of human rights advocacy on quote unquote domestic issues?
Great. Thank you so much, Cassandra, for this opening and for organizing. This is really indeed an important conversation. And I also want to salute all the women and who are on this panel for leading the struggle for equality, for dignity, for women, and for everyone's rights. I think that it's just every day that we work hard on this, not just on March 8th. I think that your question, I think that we need to look at, yeah, it's true that it seems that human rights remains on the periphery and it's not, so to speak, mainstreamed enough. Though I think that they have to look at where we have made great successes. And I think that we have, if you look back at the history of the United States with engaging with the human rights framework, with the international human rights system, it was kind of a relationship where the United States had not fully really invested, had not really been committed to the international human rights, has always found ways to exempt itself from what happens to human rights at home, right? And it had presented itself, and we saw this happening over the years. But we made a real progress since the Bricker Amendments were introduced in the early 50s. In the last century, where there was a serious push to limit the way that international treaties, international law in general had an impact on US domestic law. Now, yes, unfortunately, ultimately, that has helped this kind of organized opposition to human rights over the years by a very intentional movement that has made it very clear that the US should be above scrutiny, should be above, in certain situations, above international accountability. And that movement still exists in the conservative circles, in the ideological right-wing circles, and even some of them mainstream and center. Even within the Democratic Party, people are not fully on board with the idea that human rights is something that we should be doing ourselves domestically first, rather than preaching the rest of the world about. But I think when we look at what happened in the last 20 years or so, particularly when there was much more effort to look inward and say, United States is failing to uphold its human rights, we see that major organizations are more seriously taking the international human rights framework. Organizations or major organizations, historic organizations or networks like the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, change its name to become in the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. The creation of the US Human Rights Network was really a culmination of movements coming together from different backgrounds and people who have for years worked on this issue of making sure that the United States is held accountable, particularly in the context of racial injustice, where there's a long history of Black organizers and leaders and organizations taking the struggle internationally in order to make sure that the United States is not left to be judged only by domestic courts and domestic accountability mechanisms that treated issues of human rights violations as domestic affairs, as Malcolm X, for example, said in one of his speeches. But when you say human rights, it's really more broadly. So you have also grassroots organizations more forcefully now embracing and using the human rights framework, not just the more established organizations that have taken a more serious look and use of the human rights framework. We also need to look at the way that people are not on the defensive anymore. There's still some cynicism. So people are asking questions, why human rights? But I think there's much more confidence that, especially in the last few years, that there has to be some transformative shift, a structural shift in the way that we take or we deal with our human rights obligations and our engagement with the world, and how to connect between domestic policy and foreign policy. And I think we have made really a much more progress in the last few years, especially because people understand now that after Trump, we had to invite in international observers to observe our elections. That's something that has been going on, but more so, people were aware of the need to bring scrutiny to our very fundamental rights, the right to vote. But more importantly, and we will talk more about that, is the way that we have denied so many people access to justice, denied so many people access to fundamental human rights, particularly for people of African descent, of Black people in this country. And I think that what we're seeing now is that the embrace of human rights framework has brought many changes at the national, state, and local level. You have state and local human rights officials and human rights institutions that are more taking seriously their human rights responsibilities, that are speaking out in human rights terms, and they are translating some of these international commitments, human rights commitments, into specific domestic policy. And I will give specific examples. We have also a stronger transnational solidarity movement that we can talk more about, and that was presented at the world stage following the murder of George Floyd last June. We also have a closer collaboration and coordination and relationship between the US-based organizations, including grassroots organizations and international human rights bodies that usually have been very hesitant of engaging and looking at what's happening in the United States. The fact that you have Commissioner McCauley is part of this conversation as a normal thing. That was not something that was taken for granted. It was something that is really an impact of the movement increasingly using human rights and engaging with international human rights bodies, special rapporteurs engaging with the Human Rights Council, with the UN monitoring bodies that monitor compliance with human rights. The fact that this is also reflecting in some of our policies. For example, we were able to shift the conversation around issues of such as solitary confinement from framing it as just a civil rights violation or violations of the 8th Amendment, prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, framing it as a form of torture that impacting individuals' indignity, and push for categorical ban on the use of solitary confinement, particularly against particular communities that are particularly vulnerable. These are something that has a direct connection to our international human rights advocacy and commitments, and how it is brought into these processes. The way of groups are mainstreaming right to water and water sanitation issues, criminalization of poverty and issues of criminalization of homelessness has become mainstream in the way that it's a human rights issue. The right to healthcare is no longer treated as, oh, it's just a matter of a civil right or a privilege. It is talked about as a human right. And in the context of the larger context of making the shifts, I would say that while we are not fully, of course, we have not, this is a marathon, this is not a short race. We need to continue to engage. The fact that this administration, the Biden administration, for the first time is saying, and the president is saying, there is no longer a bright line between foreign and domestic policy. And Secretary Blinken adds to this to say that we have to take seriously our human rights not only just abroad, but at home, and to really connect between foreign and domestic policy. So it's our role to hold them accountable. It's our role to engage with Congress, with civil and state and local governments in order to make sure that these are not just aspirational commitments, and make them more connected to the lives of people. And as more and more people participate and directly impacted individuals take center stage, as we saw, and as you will hear more at the recent initiative that we launched at the Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamil. And thanks for those very specific examples, because I think that's one of the difficult things for people to pull this conversation out of the abstract and to really look at what are some very clear areas where we've been able to link human rights to issues that people face in this country. People still face the issues regarding to lack of access to clean water, right? We all know about Flint. So this is, so that was really helpful. Thank you. Now I want to turn to Salma. So Salma, you lead strategic UN advocacy work for a global NGO, and you've partnered with Jamil and a broad coalition of US NGOs and families impacted by police violence to secure the first of its kind UN Human Rights Council resolution on structural discrimination and police violence. And that resolution specifically cited police killings in the US and catalyzed a whole global study at the UN. Why was this resolution so important, and what were the challenges in holding the US accountable?
Thank you very much for organizing and for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part of this panel, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. So why was it important? First, the urgent debate that was held at the United Nations Human Rights Council in June 2020 marked an unprecedented moment in the institution's long history. This was the first time that a Western country and a P5, so one of the permanent members of the United Nations and has the veto Security Council, had been held accountable at this level for human rights violations occurring within its borders and at the hands of their government. It was also the first time ever that a victim's family speaks at the opening of the debate at the Human Rights Council. So it was opened by Philonis Floyd, the brother of George Floyd, and he gave a very powerful and moving statement. He explained the reality of racist policing in the US, the repression of peaceful protests, and he pleaded to the council to help Black people in America. And so now I want to focus my intervention to tell you about what happened in Geneva, and in particular the challenges through the behind the scenes negotiations around the urgent debate and the resolution. So as Jamil referred, so in response to the murder of George Floyd in the US and the global outrage and protest that it sparked, and the letter by victims' families, which was supported by over 600 organizations from across the world, the African group of states requested the Human Rights Council to convene an urgent debate on the current racially inspired human rights violations, systemic racism, police brutality, and violence against peaceful protesters. The African group also presented a draft resolution, which was to be adopted with at the conclusion of the urgent debate. And the original draft called for the establishment of an independent commission of inquiry into systemic racism and police violence in the US and across the world. And as I mentioned, over 160 NGOs led by ACLU and US Human Rights Network and the families were calling for an investigation into the US. And the United Nations special rapporteurs or UN independent experts supported this call, and they added that the Council must also establish a thematic commission of inquiry to investigate systemic racism in law enforcement globally, with a focus on systemic racism rooted in legacies of colonialism and transatlantic slavery. And the UN experts stressed that both measures were necessary and cannot be substituted for one for the other. And so now I run you through what happened behind the scenes in these closed door negotiations in Geneva around the urgent debate and then around the resolution. So during the negotiations of the original resolution, the United States allies, including Western countries, so all of the European Union countries, some Latin American states and some Asian states as well, were saying racism is a global problem. So why are you focusing on the US, and why are you focusing on people of African descent? They defended the US, saying that they trust that the administration will provide justice and for respect of rule of law. They also said that international investigation is too much for the US, that there should be an incremental approach. And essentially they were saying that the US situation in the US does not merit an international investigation because its national system is working and the violations are not that grave. And so these statements by the United States allies in the negotiations really exposed their hypocrisy, right? Because these are the same countries that are always leading international investigations on other countries at the Human Rights Council. And they say that they rely on human rights criteria to decide when the council should scrutinize these situations. And in this situation with the United States, the same criteria applied showed that it merits the council's attention, and we raised this as NGOs in the negotiations, but all of that fell on deaf ears because in the end it was not about merits or about principles, it was about power and politics, and their behaviors or their actions were essentially saying that Black lives don't matter as much when they're killed by US officials as if when they're killed in Africa. And then during the urgent debate, the Western states who did mention the US did so to defend it, saying that they trust its democratic institutions, and then other states made really general statements saying racism is everywhere, racism is bad, we should fight it together. And they really missed the urgency of the debate. The only statements that actually responded to this urgency of the debate and genuinely pushed for accountability for victims rather than just settling political scores were Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa. Now, behind the scenes in the negotiation of the resolution, the US and their allies worked really hard to water down the text. So they wanted to remove all references to the United States of America, all references to the name George Floyd, even the word Minnesota, and to even remove the ask calling on the High Commissioner to report on police violence in her updates to the Council. So it wasn't even at this point about the international investigation anymore. This was just one excuse. It was about shielding the United States from scrutiny. And just to highlight that it was not only the European Union countries and Western countries, but also Latin American countries pressured the African group to water down the text. And so to sum up this behind the scenes pressure and lobbying, it just really exposed how these states were only paying a lip service to anti-racism because they said in their statements during the urgent debate in public, Black Lives Matter, but their actions in private, for me, it seemed that of white supremacists. And so there were several versions circulating, and it was a very volatile situation, and we didn't even know if a council member is going to call for a vote on even this very watered down text. And so in the end, the outcome, which was adopted on the 19th of June, was resolution 43/1. It was adopted by consensus, and it explicitly mentioned the words United States of America in one paragraph, which was recalling a statement by the African Union chair. Now, although the resolution did not create an international investigation on the US, it is nevertheless a resolution about the US, even without explicitly saying it, because all the statements the resolution refers to by the special procedures, by the African Union, High Commissioner, the Inter-American Commission are all about the US. And the High Commissioner will prepare a report with support of special procedures, which will be submitted in June to the Human Rights Council.
Thank you so much, Salma. And you said something that struck me when you said that a lot of Latin American states tried to shield the United States. And there's a parallel conversation that is happening about how Afro-Latinx people are subject to extreme levels of police violence in their own countries. So that was an interesting parallel in that the powers that be in those countries would also try to shield the US. Now turning to Vicky. So thank you for joining us, Vicky. The human rights fight for racial justice in the US is about changes in law, policy, and lived experience. Can you talk about why your local work and organizing in Chicago and other jurisdictions seeks to operationalize human rights principles for those most affected by violations? In other words, how Black Lives Matter and other grassroots movements are human rights movements and therefore have their place in current organizing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Again, thank you to SJI and to everyone for organizing this important forum. So I guess speaking specifically for what I can almost call the Chicago case for bringing human rights home, although there are several instances, the most important thing to note is that this is not new. Right, this is there is a long and strong history that we know globally that for oppressed peoples to speak up, to push back, and to demand their rights. They may not be articulating them in the human rights language, and so from that standpoint, it's been a real blessing for, as Jamil mentioned, not quite 20 years ago. Can you hear me okay, Cassandra?
The sound is a little mangled, but I can hear what you're saying. It's coming through, so you can keep going.
Okay. For basically the U.S. Human Rights Network, I'm going to mute my camera just in case. That maybe will help. Muting the video may help a little.
Yes, it helps. Go ahead.
Awesome. The U.S. Human Rights Network actually has been integral to helping build the human rights education that needs to happen here on the ground. So not just Chicago, but across this nation, to be able to just explain the concept that we are not taught here in this country, right? We know civil rights. We don't realize that that's just a small piece of the overall pie. So just speaking specifically to the Chicago situation and how it relates directly to the example of the Black Lives Matter movement, there was an issue of, as we're calling it, police brutality, but we know, just as with the Derek Chauvin situation and George Floyd, that this is far beyond just brutality. It literally is, in our case, there was a couple of decades experience of rogue police and the commander literally torturing primarily Black men, but they were actually teenagers, so young people. The most heinous forms of torture that could be often to life sentences for crimes in many cases that they did not even commit. To cut to the chase, after literally decades of doing everything possible through Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and ACLU and just many of the traditional tactics and techniques, more awareness was able to be brought to bear, but purely working in the courts was falling short because the civil law has tricks and boxes that allow not just police, but the whole law enforcement system to remain unaccountable. So we found that from prosecutors to actually the then mayor ultimately, all were complicit in not only allowing this to go, these egregious human rights violations to go unaddressed, but actually to contributing to the ongoing conspiracy. So what the game changer actually was a group of grassroots folks from the affected community deciding that we're going to find a way to hold people accountable, and literally did look to the lesson from our history, from not only Brother Malcolm X, but back to the 40s when there was a group, Paul Robeson and NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois, and others, decades and decades and decades ago, who said, you know what, we're going to take this to the international forum. This is a human issue. So long story short, through the U.S. Human Rights Network and being able to connect with other attorneys, educators, students, law students, grassroots, teachers, you name it, this collective of people learned first, okay, there's something called the OAS, the Organization of American States, which Commissioner McCauley spoke to. So we first literally sought this redress just to be able to have some of the directly impacted families and a couple of individuals who had done their time and been released 20 years and wanted to speak about, at least for someone to listen. We found that there was a hearing. The State Department showed up, and previously we didn't really know what response there would be. We then were connected with rapporteurs and special rapporteurs who came to help work with us to do town hall meetings. And long story short, ultimately took delegation to Geneva, Switzerland, to be able to speak both under the CERD, Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and also the CAT, the Convention Against Torture. And we found that when the people who are directly affected are able to speak for themselves, then that, number one, it does two things. Number one, people begin to be able to name and claim their own rights. That's a victory in and of itself. You're not waiting for someone else to do something for you. The turning point was realizing that the UN mechanisms are not just in Geneva. We can bring those concluding observations, the recommendations, the statements of the commissioners and the special rapporteurs and the working groups back home, and we literally are holding people accountable at the city level. And then I will say that timing is perfect. There literally was continuing to be an ongoing movement of the youth, in some cases specifically Black Lives Matter activists, in other cases young people, primarily young people, but and allies. It's intergenerational, and they're making the demands that we are going to be human rights enforcers. And whether, I'll close with this, whether or not the United States has ratified a convention or not, we're going to hold local decision makers, lawmakers, policy legislators accountable to that higher standard of human rights, which is not just civil rights, it's economic, social, cultural, civil, political. And so to that point, the conscious, I will say, law student, scholar, practitioner is just crucial, because we find that folks are working collaboratively and in community, not just through the courts. And when you work in the courts and in the streets, that is where the Black Lives Matter movement has pushed some of these decisions to the forefront. And we've had a modicum of change. And they're very clear we're not stopping now. So we hope that you will join us and work with us at the U.S. Human Rights Network. We're ready to lead, follow, and continue to march forward.
Thank you, Vicki. And students, you heard, Vicki's waiting for you to join forces with them. And this is a great segue, actually, because I want to talk about the report that the ICHR issued. So Margaret, the ICHR issued a very powerful report addressing police violence against Black Americans. Can you tell us a little bit about what some of those recommendations were and where we stand today? And please, Jamil, Selma, Vicki, feel free to input as well.
Yes, thank you. I have a note too on that in that regard about the report, which is one of the strengths of the commission, is that we can publish these reports. And through our investigations and reports, which we receive from civil society and victims and whoever, and even from the media, we can include in a report a real indictment against any state which is failing to uphold any particular right. And in that report, which was launched in Harvard University, we made many recommendations, and quite frankly, I'm not going to be able to tell you all of them because I didn't address my mind to the particulars of it, because I was sure that you would have told your students and gone through the entire report with them. Anyway, one of the most important things is in such reports is that the commission tells the state, you have failed in this, and you have to do one, you have to provide due process to the victims of such violence which have been occurring, and you have not. It's been, these things remain in impunity So therefore, you must have due process, which means a proper independent investigation of how the violation occurred, who is responsible. And when that's answered, there'll be prosecution in the courts against the perpetrators. And in relation to police violence, well, I think everybody in the world knows that the impunity in America is egregious in the United States, is egregious. And so we focus quite a bit on that. And that we also recommended that there should be independent monitoring bodies of police conduct. Which these are lots of the things that came up after George Floyd's murder, which should examine the conduct of the police officers. But you cannot go on with the kind of mechanisms which they have in place, which are self-involved within the police force, and they have to be independent bodies, independent of the forces. I think then they have to look at the training of the police officers and instill whatever changes are necessary to end the impunity. Because I think yesterday I heard, or day before, I heard of an incident in which this police officer who tear gassed a 9-year-old, pepper sprayed a 9-year-old, and then a shot, nothing happened to him. A short while later, a pepper sprayed a woman with her toddler in her hand. And again, nothing specific has happened. They said they will investigate, but who will investigate? That is the point. The result, you will get a result which is not objective to protect the rights of the citizens who are aggrieved in these circumstances. So we dealt a great deal with this, and we tried in the report to show the harm which comes out of police activity which are left unrecognized and without reparation for the victims. Now, this is a focus that I as rapporteur have had for quite a while, that I am shocked at a common law country not dealing with these things, not providing compensation and reparation, not admitting a wrong in some of its agents, when all the world knows and can see, especially now, thank God for the telephones, what the wrongdoings are. We also try to urge the United States to legislate, to get legislation going, which would be really protective of their citizens, and that they have to treat with the Afro-Americans who are the victims or largest victims of this kind of abuse in a way that would enhance their life in every particular, in education, employment, housing, health, security, and so on. That's all I can think of at the moment.
No, that is plenty. Thank you. And
I also want to mention just one thing very quickly. We had asked Canada some years ago, that they must have a national, independent national inquiry on the discrimination and violence against Indigenous peoples, and especially women, and sexual violations, which they did eventually have it. And they published a report in which they found out that indeed they had been violating rights with impunity. So these national reports, commissions are very important, but I cannot see in the United States that we will succeed in that. Some states may do it within their state bodies, but the United States as a state party, I think that may be rather difficult, but we should start with each individual state at first.
Thank you. So Jamil, actually, I have a question regarding that is very much related to that. So considering the absence of the usual methods of redress and remedies for racial discrimination, whether individual or structural, particularly in US courts, what are the benefits then of engaging in the international system?
Well, I mean, as you heard, a lot of it is really a matter of how do we influence the United States system, legal system, in a way that will provide effective legal redress and access to justice. How do the most marginalized people will be able to get that sort of enjoyment of all their human rights? And I think it has to be the echo chamber. It has to be the way that how do we use the international engagement, all the reports and recommendations, the things that Vicky talked about, how do we bring them back here in a very forceful way? And that is something that is an ongoing process. It's something that a lot of grassroots organizations are doing. National, state, and local groups, NGOs are doing that. So just to give you a quick examples, on the issue of, for example, on proving discrimination, racial discrimination in the United States, the United States laws are more, over the years, they're closed the doors of the courts for people to be able to get a remedy for acts of racial discrimination, for even acts of horrific violence by police violence, all kinds of doctrines like qualified immunity and what have you that have been well established. And there is an attempt now to do away with these sort of impediment to access to justice. But in particular, the international human rights law provides this blueprint or this framework to show that you can actually, this is the meaning of access to justice. This is the meaning to access to effective remedy. You can't just put a requirement to prove intentional discrimination, but rather disparate impact is part of the definition of racial discrimination under the international treaties that the US has ratified, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, for example. Similarly, when it comes to use of force, the international norms are far more advanced and protective of the people's physical integrity and their ability to be able to protect themselves from the state violence, state-sanctioned violence by police officers, other law enforcement. That is something that can be changed. And in fact, some of the proposals that we put forward, both at the federal, state, and local level, are going in the right direction of closing the gap and making sure that the US use of force policies are more in line with human rights law. That is, it has to be a last resort. It has to be necessary. And there will be other measures that are less lethal that could be used in order to address the situation. The shifting the resources and attention from policing to alternatives to policing. For example, when you have mental health crises, these are things that are rooted in really looking at and analyzing situations using a human rights intersectional lens. Looking at gender violence, for example, in the recent decade or more than decade, we have led, and the Human Rights Institute at Columbia University with the ACLU, with Miami Human Rights Clinic, and other organizations have worked and championed the cause of Jessica Linehan Gonzalez. And her cause for justice before the Inter-American Commission had led to concrete changes in the United States of not only expanding the awareness of the importance of fighting domestic violence as a human rights issue, as an urgent human rights crisis, but and leading some ordinance in the state and local level and laws, and but also guidance at the federal level, something that we have seen during the Obama administration. Luckily, it hasn't been overturned during the Trump administration, where the Justice Department issued a guidance on gender biased policing and law enforcement in response to domestic violence and sexual assault. And that guidance, you say, well, it's not a law, it's just a guidance. It could be ignored. Yes, but you got to start somewhere. And the 2015 guidance is something that we hope that will be picked up, will be enforced, and will be also reflected in federal, state, and local law. So all the mobilization that we do has to have a policy changes at those levels. And I think there's a lot of potential for doing that. The same and final word about reparations. The reparations framework is something that the Commission and I would really want to thank here Commissioner McCauley for leading that expanding the analysis of racial justice or the redress for racial justice in the United States by using access to reparations and the reparations framework. And that's what the commission did in its report. And now it's been picked up by more organizations. There's been a history of organization in the US led by Black-led organizations calling for reparations for historic injustices, slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, and other horrific individual and collective violations against people of African descent. But the more modern framework of human rights have made it very clear that a reparations framework means a number of things that you need to do in order to address historic injustices, but also deal with moving forward. And I think that is something that we see, for example, in the concept of restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, meaning that you have to make sure that there are cessation of violations, and also the guarantees that there will be no repetition, and that we see on and on and on with regard to state-sanctioned violence, with regard to other human rights violations, that we don't see really closing the hole that allow or ending impunity for these kinds of practices to continue without accountability. So if we really look at the human rights framework, it gives us guidance, it gives us really a blueprint for change and structural change, not just a change of, okay, we will just remedy here and put out fires, but really institutionally, how do we do that? And I think we have now a movement for Black Lives, a Black Lives Matter movement, organizations that are doing this work, are championing this cause, and we have to listen more to what they are asking, what they're demanding, what are they calling for at all levels. We have to be supportive of that call. And I think, as Vicky and others said, centering the most directly impacted. We learn from their experiences. That's why we benefited from the fact that it was the Mothers Against Police Brutality that championed the cause of police accountability at the highest level of the UN human rights system. Without their voices, we could have not achieved what we achieved. And that, I think, is an ongoing thing that we continue to make sure that is what happens. It is not, human rights is not about a top-down, it has to be a bottom-up approach to changing structurally the problems on the ground.
That's huge. I'm going to thank you, Jamil. It's Vicky. I was encouraged to jump in. I wanted to add a couple more quick things, and I went off camera again. I'm terrified. I'm on my stepson's laptop, and I have no idea what avatar he may have there. He's a Trekkie, so. But I wanted to share just again quickly with regard to your question, Cassandra, about how do we apply that international? How do we make the link? And one of the ways is literally an emerging human rights cities movement, whereby, for example, just as we sit here with International Women's Day being something that we speak to, yet we here in the U.S. are struggling to get CEDAW ratified, right? Back to that American exceptionalism. We don't have the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women ratified. We don't have the Convention on the Rights of the Child ratified here in the U.S. of all places. So what the people-centered human rights movement has begun doing is just, again, educating ourselves and demanding, claiming our rights, and not waiting for this nation state to ratify them, holding our local officials in cities and communities accountable. And in many cases, well, some cases, there are local levels of municipalities that have adopted and agreed to abide by these various international norms, which is huge. So from that standpoint, every law, every policy, every business that's seeking to come into the community is going to have to be assessed by that measure, so that when we, and I appreciate it, someone dropped into the chat, the Movement for Black Lives policy platforms, and specifically, that articulation of a reparation, because one of the things we had to learn, we learned just back to the Chicago police torture lesson, was that it was a huge victory, still just partial justice, but a huge victory to be able to bring back concluding observations and put them before the judges to say, this is what you are supposed to be doing. We now have judges in Illinois who have been trained, I would say, they write into their opinions what they quote, the rapporteur on torture, right? So we're, in that way, you literally are transforming US law, because you've established this precedent and begun to embed the human rights language and mechanisms and framework into that, where it was not previously the case. So there are a couple of things there. And then with regard to reparation, again, lifting up that this is the 20th anniversary of the World Conference on Racism, and the Durban Declaration. It's the impetus for the International Decade for People on African Descent. And so with regard to the conversation about reparations for the Holocaust of African enslavement, many people are very, very, very clear that that does mean, again, in the international definition, that means that there is some repair that must be done with regard to that stolen wealth, the bodies, the land, you name it. But separately, with the victory that we were able to win in part in Chicago with regard to Chicago police torture, which after 40 years of not being able to really make headway, 4 years of really applying the international human rights frame. And as I said, starting with the Organization of American States and the Inter-American Commission, and utilizing every other single mechanism that we could, there was finally a victory in that the US could no longer ignore the fact that they were being held accountable, to say, you know, in the terms of CAT and other stakeholder reports that we continue to write, and the testimony that was given in Geneva and the town hall meetings that happened again back home. So there's a sense that there's a human rights budgeting, there's human rights view of how we need to look at every single decision that's made going forward in the United States that will elevate it. And that is reparations in action every day.
Thank you, Vicki. Actually, I'm going to turn to one of the questions that that is in the chat. And it's the question is, similarly to the US, the UK has become very hostile to the concept of critical race theory and Black Lives Matter in general, going as far as trying to introduce regulations against these topics being covered in schools. What do you think is the best way to continue challenging this globally spreading hostility to positive change? And anyone can take that question. Go ahead, Margaret.
Can I just say a few words very quickly, because I have to leave. In fact, I should have left, but it is clear to me, and this is not a commission's point of view, it's clear to me that of course Britain would take that position, because its guilt is enormous. No, Britain has never apologized for what its history was in enslaving all these Africans, becoming rich and building up infrastructures in Britain from their blood, sweat, and death, and then colonizing their countries of origin and removing the valuable resources and taking them all back to Britain. And they still continued to do so, because they left these countries, even at independence, very economically unstable, to ensure poverty, that one would still rely on them for their assistance, and assistance given at a cost, not free. And remember that they paid a compensation. They repaired the harm done to the owners of slaves, but not to the slaves who suffered. To my mind, it is a clear case of I cannot dare admit anything, because I will be convicted of everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And this question is so timely, in case you watched that interview that Megan and Larry gave last night that really was an indictment on the British Crown. I also wanted to turn a little bit to, someone mentioned how the mothers, right, the Black mothers lifted these issues on the international stage. And today is International Women's Day, and I want to celebrate the Black women. And I wonder if anyone would like to say a few words about the role that these women have played in this human rights movement.
Do it justice. It is integral, it's crucial, and they deserve our support.
Yeah, I would say I've, my work in the last year, particularly with my friend, or I call as a friend, Colette Flanagan, who is the executive director and founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, learned so much from her leadership, from her vision and the thinking about how to approach and how to seek justice and accountability. So I think we not only salute women like Colette and others who are working in that space with a lot of pain, with a lot of agony, with a lot of emotions that they carry on, but they do it because they seek change for everyone else. And I think that is really crucially important. And I was just discussing yesterday with a friend, the history of this country. The history of this country is really built on racial discrimination and denying of basic rights for people of African descent, for genocide against people of indigenous peoples, but also against women, and the way that women have been completely isolated, completely denied their basic humanity. And when they were women and Black, then there will be multiple forms of discrimination, and that in of itself makes it even more urgent to listen to those voices of Black women and their history of struggle. That really should be ways for us to look forward, and that is the hopeful thing of seeing how the United States is the movement of Black lives is founded by amazing Black women, and the fact that there are a lot of women are leading the charge now. I think we just need to really, again, humbly listen to them and to follow their footsteps to get to a better place for the United States that will also impact other places around the world, because I think what we do in the US has a greater impact. It is not anymore a domestic issue. It is a transnational movement for Black lives. It's a transnational movement for racial justice. And what we saw at the United Nations is going to continue to have an impact around the world because of the work of those mothers and their families and the people who are championing this cause in the United States.
Thank you so much. And I think, Salma, go ahead.
Just very briefly, I also wanted to add my voice to what Jamila and Dr. Vicky were saying, to really salute the women and to say that, in Geneva, we follow their cue, right? Like our role is to facilitate that space so that they lead the struggles and the fight for justice. And it's the fact that the urgent debate happened, that the High Commissioner came out and said that she would be guided by victims and their families and their communities in the preparation and the shaping of the report, is thanks to their leadership and to speaking out and leading these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. And I think this is a good note to leave this conversation on. Listen to Black women. When we fight, we don't just fight for our rights, we fight for everybody's rights, and everybody benefits from it. So thank you so much to our panelists. There have been an amazing list of resources that have been dropped in the chat. We will send them to you along with this video when that is ready in a few days, to all the participants who've registered for this talk. Thank you again. Happy International Women's Day, and keep on the good fight.